In linguistics, there is a thing called Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis. So I know a little bit about many languages, and it has always been interesting the way you express things in a language rather than the other. When I started learning, or better to say studying French, Spanish, and Portuguese, I noticed that all of these languages, these are obviously closely related. They're children of Latin, and they have a lot of similarities. One of the similarities is that there are two articles. Let's just focus on the definite articles. So in Spanish, you have el and you have la. The reason you have two different articles is that words in Spanish belong to two different genders. The same is true about Portuguese and French. If you're studying a new language, depending on how different that language is from your native language, you're going to face challenges in the sense that you may see that it's necessary for you to start thinking about things in a different way than you used to think in your native language. Because the structures in this new language, let's in this case just say Spanish, require you to say things in a particular way. Let's say your first language is English and then you want to learn Spanish. Obviously in English you have he and she, but that's pretty much where the gender ends. Other than third person singular, there's almost no gender in English. There are words like actor and actress, but unless you want to be specifically referring to a female actor, you can use the word actor even about female actors. The only time you feel that you need to specify gender is when you're going to use he or she. But then if you go across to Spanish, the word for book is masculine and the word for the moon is feminine and the sun is masculine. This is a very basic example of how, if you want to speak properly in Spanish, you need to look at words in a gendered way. But obviously the difference between languages are not limited to gender. There's so much that you will face when you go from language A to language B. In the 19th century, there were two linguists who studied Native American languages. In these languages, the way you talk about the world is, if you don't want to say fundamentally, but it's considerably different than you talk about things in English. In American Indian languages, I'm going to mention a few examples from the Hopi language from Arizona, which was studied by Sapir-Whorf. In this language, there are terms for words like lightning, wave, and flame, and meteor, or even puff of smoke and pulsation. These words in English are obviously nouns, but in the Hopi language, the words that are used to refer to these phenomena are all verbs. And the reason for that is that the speakers of Hopi perceive these phenomena to be of a short duration in nature. So a lightning lasts for a very short period of time, and so does a flame. This is why in their language, it is important to focus on the duration of that thing that you want to refer to, which in English you use a noun for. However, when there are other phenomena like clouds and storms, which are of a much longer duration, you are allowed to use nouns. It may take you a while to get used to the idea, but that's actually the whole point of this. In the same way that if you want to speak Spanish properly, you have to put yourself in the Spanish mindset, and whichever noun you want to use, you look at them in terms of gender. Therefore, when I started thinking about gender in Spanish, I noticed that although I'm a masculine person and I am a good person, if I want to say the same thing in Spanish, I should say yo soy una buena persona. Okay, why do I mention this example? Because me being masculine, when I refer to myself as a person, I have to use the word persona, which is by gender feminine. Regardless of your gender, persona as a word has a gender which has nothing to do with the gender of you as a subject, at least in this sentence. When you look at these things going across languages, you may, like Sapir-Whorf, come up with a hypothesis. So specifically, Whorf said, we dissect nature along lines laid down by our native languages, by the linguistic systems in our minds. In other words, here we're talking about the relationship between language and thought. You might say, we use language to talk about reality. Before we know what reality is, we express things in a certain way depending on what language we speak. Then the question becomes the relationship between language and thought. The relationship between language and thought has been reflected on for thousands of years, even outside of linguistics and philosophy. And the main question is, well, at least for the purposes of this video, is, does the structure of language influence the way we think about the world? Or in other words, does the structures provided by the language determine how we perceive reality? Or, if you want to go farther, does language determine thought? If you believe that language determines thought, you believe in a kind of linguistic determinism, which is a very hard or strict interpretation of what in linguistics or sociolinguistics we refer to as the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis. The Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis is a hypothesis, or you could say a theory. It basically states that the differences in worldview that are imposed by linguistic structures in any given language determine how we think about the world. This framing of the relationship between language and thought can be interpreted in different ways. Generally speaking, making such comments about language comes under the topic of linguistic relativity, and you may have soft to hard or weak to strong interpretations of these or this hypothesis. You may interpret it in a very strict way, or you say, yes, language determines the way we think, or you may just say language influences the way we think about the world. The Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis, SWH, it cannot be experimentally tested to be verified or falsified. It's just a general model of looking at language. One of the areas of language use in which the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis might become relevant is translation. Because if you believe in a strong version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, you might think that translation is actually impossible because there are no two languages in which the frameworks are absolutely similar. I mean, some languages might be more similar to each other than other languages, but it would make it difficult or impossible to translate something from language A to language B. However, in recent years, the advances in providing a lot of good translation across languages has reduced the tendency to believe, at least in a strong version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Therefore, if you ask a typical linguist what he or she thinks about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, probably they would say, yes, our language influences the way we perceive the world, but it does not totally determine it, which is a safe position or a cautious position to adopt. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis remains of considerable relevance to contemporary sociolinguistic debates, especially when it comes to the topic of political correctness, because any adherence to political correctness implies that you believe in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. What is political correctness? It's basically about talking about things in a proper way. In political correctness, you may disagree with certain ways of talking about things, and you may strongly prescribe that we should talk about certain topics in a particular way rather than the other. And if you didn't believe in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, you wouldn't believe in political correctness either. Does the way we frame our discussion going to emancipate or further oppress such minorities? Does the way we conceive or frame things actually make a difference in real life? Does it impact our thinking in a meaningful way, or constant as a result of that, our actions? In other words, can we reshape our reality by reshaping our language? Anyways, this is an open question. What do you think about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis? Do you subscribe to it? Do you subscribe to a weak version of it or a strong version of it? What are your arguments for that?